seven founding fathers of sociology, and I think Weber was one of them. And sociology and psychology have a very specific connection, and I mentioned experience, and I mentioned experiments that uses the scientific method that incorporates psychology in light of sociology. So, and underneath the umbrella of sociology, there are many sub-disciplines that we can look at. Psychology is one of them. And I also further noted that sociology is predicated on the strong scientific orientation. So I mentioned briefly some of the indications, implications, and sociology in practice, in law, in history, in political science. Those were some of the things that we mentioned in the first day. And first day, basically, we went over the syllabus, went over what we needed, and now we're in the second day, second lecture of the week. In sociology's method and research, sociology is social science. I mentioned science and scientific method. I went deeply into why we can trust scientific method. We can apply that readily to sociology, because sociology is in itself a science. It's a science. We call that a social science. So study, it's queen of the sciences. It encompasses all philosophies. It's an umbrella term for many other subdisciplines. Therefore, scientific method can be readily applied to social science, sociology. And in scientific method, there is also always a hypothesis. Then we collect data. Then we conclude from that data to see if the hypothesis is correct or not. Sociology as science cannot be as accurate and as exact as physical science. Physical science has experiments that quantify using mathematics or other exact science disciplines in order to conclude, to bolster your hypothesis or prove your hypothesis wrong. But social sciences can prove different things in our lives that are not accurate and exact. For instance, by sociology, it proceeds with meaningful investigations, experiments, and understanding. So, especially psychology experiments. That's why sociology often tends to be how in effect psychoanalytic, meaning can't readily be gauged or be accurate and exacting, but it is noteworthy for it is a science. It is a social science, and it can be studied, can be measured in some way, shape, or form. Study of sociology has very profound implications on its data, applications of those theoretical data. So we're not doing anything new. With this application of scientific method and research, we're not doing anything new. We're actually going back and doing what Emil Durkheim did. Emil Durkheim was the first person to use the scientific method, and it was very revolutionary for that era. For scientific method was pretty new, untested. I also moved on, progressed to week 3, to our third lecture, to the foundations of sociology. Foundations. Our foundations of sociology was we were under the impression, guys, that science was used to build a better world. Science was being utilized for the betterment of the world, man, society, nation, country, and sociology, because the scientific method was applied, we believe sociology had use. It was utilitarian. We also noted that sociology and all these seven fathers, this began happening right about the time of the Industrial Revolution. And we, a little bit back to in our history, Industrial Revolution revolutionized our lives for many, many reasons. And people think it was only one industrial revolution, but there were many phases, and we're still in the industrial. We call today, right now, what's happening with the AI and EV technology, with all this technological advances. We say we're being automated, that there's automation going on. Everything that used to have, for instance, retail stores are closing down because people are shopping more and more online. All these revolutions that's happened, we call it the fourth industrial revolution. So roughly there were three, meaning because this is the fourth, we're living in a fourth industrial revolution era. That basically implies its premise is that there were three industrial revolutions before, prior to the fourth. I think one of them is the steam engine. The steam engine brought one of the first industrial revolutions. Steam engines increased production, because steam engines were used in factories, and steam engines were used in locomotives, meaning goods were being transported further and more efficiently and quicker. And one side effect of these industrial revolution was that people, for thousands of years, and in feudalistic Europe and so on and so forth, and many in some of the developing countries, still societies are relatively, majority of the people are agrarian, meaning their way of life is farming. They go to a land. If they don't own a land, they borrow a land from a wealthy landowner, and they would cultivate that land and pay rent, and also make a living off the land. For most of the history of Europe, the West, and even in developing countries, the majority of the people were agrarian. They were farmers. They lived off the land. But what happened during what was so revolutionary in the Industrial Revolution was that the young people started going into the cities because there were more work in the cities, and factories began popping up, production skyrocketed, and people were moving toward the city. They did not want to live in rural areas, in land, living off the land. They rather came to the city looking for work, and they worked in factories. And in that time, because people were coming and more gathering toward the city, sociological problems erupted, and that is kind of the background of how sociology developed rapidly as people got together, and as social interactions began happening. There was more of a need for a social study of sociology. So these were the foundations of sociology. And what happened during Industrial Revolution and in the study of sociology, in early sociology, basically in capitalism, which is how Industrial Revolution functioned. In capitalism, the owner of the factory became pretty much the wealthy landowners and lords of the past. So in a sense, the capitalist or the factory owner, he owned every means of the production. He monopolized the production, meaning that the workers owned none of the produce goods or the part of the business that was happening in the factories. So this meant that the ruling upper wealthy owners, factory owners, they owned and they exploited the workers. That is why workers' unions, labor parties, even socialism began to come, because Karl Marx especially started writing about these inequalities, social inequalities, modern living in global work, cultural identity. He wrote a lot about these things that ultimately the working class, they had to somehow unshackle their chains, revolt, make another revolution, and he called for a worldwide global workers' revolution, where it brought about the fall of the bourgeois, which were the owners, factory owners, and the capitalists, basically. And then, because with the fall of this bourgeois, there'll be an uprising of this working class, this majority becoming center stage in politics. And from that understanding, from that era, I moved on to institutional sociology, which brings us to the fourth week, and this was before week 5, week 6, lecture 5, lecture 6. And institutional sociology, I introduced the role of these institutions, and I focused specifically on the role of religion and government. Karl Marx had this wonderful quote. He said, "Religion is a sign of the oppressed," and he said the religion is opium for the masses, opium for the crowd. And as interesting as that quote is, all these social institutions basically summarizes what that social situation was. The working class were exploited. They were, and they weren't given a fair wage, and there were a lot of human rights issues when they would have cheap child labor, and they would go into, even especially in mines, coal mines, they would use these little kids, little boys, to go into little crowded caves in order to have access to more resources, because coal was so necessary in order to power the steam engine. They would boil water and get steam from that, and use that to use that for the fuel for the steam engine. That basically it increased the demand for coal. So all these exploitation and unsafe working situations were occurring all across, especially Europe, where the Industrial Revolution happened. And in this section, I also talked about the different social institutions that I will be talking about today. I talked about communism and how that came about. And then I talked about socialism, totalitarianism, fascism, and capitalism. In each of the social institutions, I'm going to talk about focusing on the role of religion and the role of government. And not only that, I'm going to be talking about each of them. I will have an example of a nation state, and in that nation state, how the political system, with its population, with its demographics, with its infant mortality, its population, right? And I will be talking about the role of religion the role of government, and how the relationship between the government and the religion, and how that is tolerated. So for each of these 5 social institutions, or for instance, these nation states, I will have an example of a nation state country, and some are from the past, some are from the future, not future, some are from the present, and we're going to talk about how each of these social institutions play a role in the nations today. So that's where we come to our first week, to all the way to 4th week, and then the 5th week we're going to talk about these nation states. So if you could just follow along with me, and if you have your notes, we're in week 5, and today is going to be lecture 5. I'm continuing part 2 of institutional sociology. In the first social institution I'll be covering, I think I covered a little bit last week about communism, and I began with the Soviet Union. Today I'm going to go deeper into our understanding of communism. Communism came about with the writings of Karl Marx. Karl Marx had a specific idea of how, again, his ideas were birthed in the crux of the social revolutions that were happening during the Industrial Revolution. The workers were being oppressed, they were being exploited by the ruling bourgeois, which were the wealthy owners, factory owners. They were exploiting, they were monopolizing all of part of production. The workers owned nothing. They were being paid a minuscule wage, adverse working conditions, grotesque human rights abuses that were happening, especially with children, with child labor. All these exploitations, Karl Marx wrote that enough is enough. Ultimately, there has to be a revolution that happens because the working class is the majority. The working party and the unions basically start from this, and they believe that there should be a revolution, workers' revolutions throughout the world. There's a picture of Lenin, and Lenin is the founder, basically, of Soviet Union. Soviet Union, or USSR. USSR stands for Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, 1922 to 1991. So for about 7 years, this nation state was the nation of communism, that embodied communism. The slogan for Soviet Union was "The workers of the world unite." And I love this sickle and the hammer. The symbol of sickle is basically agriculture, harvesting. And we will see that how devastating the effects of communism are in production, in life, how they tended to have a state-controlled one-party system that controlled all what was to be farmed in these collectivized farms. And you see another hammer symbolizing industry, right? Soviet Union, especially as communist, or even totalitarian countries, they focused on this World War II era of massive, not just arms race, building the army, but they were focused on almost warlike production, increase of industrialization. So economically, they were growing rapidly, and yet there were these production of all the goods led to nationwide famine. Production also when skyrocketed, and yet the working conditions were not as ideal as Karl Marx had put it in his Communist Manifesto. The Soviet Union was characterized by a highly centralized form of government. It wasn't dispersed. The power was not spread out evenly. There weren't any checks and balances. It was just a highly centralized form of government. This government lasted for so long, although it was so centralized, because it was, this is my personal belief, because it was hardened in the crucible of war. Lenin, basically what happened in the background was that the background of I will mention briefly, but the background of the establishment of the Soviet Union happened in the light of social discontent over the Tsarist government of Russia. Russia was an empire run by the Tsar, and this emperor, he was basically the king of Russia, and the royal family, the Tsar family, were basically brutally murdered, and the Bolsheviks came and seized power. And this happened during the latter stages of World War I, and in the time of World War II, this idea of communism was tested, tried, and proved. Ultimately, it prevailed. It prevailed throughout World War II, and because it was so hardened and proved under the crucible of war, maybe that is the reason why it maintained its power on the nation for so long. And what is interesting about these communist socialist states is that it's always the one-party state. It's run by one party. There are rivaling parties, but the Soviet Union, as well as China and North Korea, that we're going to talk about, is a one-party state, meaning that the nation is governed by one communist party of the Soviet Union. So this was a trend, a factor in communist countries. The capital of the Soviet Union was Moscow. Other significant and notable cities were Leningrad, Kiev, Tashkent, Alma-Ata, Novosibirsk. The Soviet Union was the largest country territorially in the world, covering over 8.6 million square miles. It spanned 11 time zones. That is pretty significant, meaning that it was the biggest country, the largest country in the world. Soviet landscape was largely inhabitable with vast tundra, taiga, steppes, desert, mountain, and so on and so forth. The Soviet people were the most diverse, included Ukrainians, Belarusian, Uzbek, Kazakh, Georgian, Azerbaijan, Lithuanian, Moldovan, Latvian, Kyrgyz, Tajik, Armenian, Turkmen, Estonian, Abkhaz, Bashkir, Buryat, Chechen, Finnish, Volga German, even Korean, Ossetian, and Polish. Very diverse, and since it's the biggest, territorially the biggest nation on earth, it included so many different diverse people groups. Its ethnic groups consisted of 70% were Eastern Slavs, 12% were Turkic, and 18% were other demographics. The population of the Soviet Union. In the picture right here, I included some other former Soviet Union countries. Soviet Union, under the Soviet Union, was the now country of Ukraine, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Georgia, Moldova, Armenia. And the lowest, the smallest are Armenians. There are basically even 3 million, and even Ukraine, Uzbek with 30 and 43 million people. Russia's population at 1991, and almost during the dissolution era during Gorbachev, 1991, the census of the population at the height, not at the height, right before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, was 290,644,721 citizens. This meant when right before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there were pretty much, give or take, about 300 million population. They had a growth rate of 0.4%. What was interesting was that the Soviet Union citizens had a very high literacy rate. They had a literacy rate of 99.8%. And what was interesting here, because it's a communist country, because it focused so much on labor, Soviet Union had a labor force of over half of its population. So about 152, that's over half. 152,300,000 labor force. 80% were industry. Remember again, the sickle and the hammer. The hammer was the industry, and 20% of all the working force were agriculture. So this understanding that economy is divided into two: agriculture and production, or industrial production, is a very naive understanding of the economy. Economy is more complex than that. But Soviet Union, had a huge labor force. Half of its population were working. And the most interesting thing of this population statistic is that 98%, that is 150 million of all workers, as half the population of the USSR, Soviet Union, were union members. Let me say that again. Almost half of the Soviet Union population were union members. All trade unions conducted their work under the guidance of the Communist Party. So you see how centralized this form of government was. Although the Communist Manifesto, written by Karl Marx, it called for a revolution of the working class, in my personal opinion. Although it called for a dramatic overhaul of the previous system, what happened was so dark. What happened was the insidious overtaking of one ruling class for another ruling class. Because think about it, over half of the population of everyone in the Soviet Union were part of the trade union, and they took orders from the guidance of the community. They say guidance, but basically they were party members. Everyone who worked were part. 99% of all workers were trade party union members. So effectively and constantly there was a market relationship between the people and the state as the employer-employee. You see that? Karl Marx called for a social revolution where the masses ruled, and yet there was a market relationship in the application of this ideal. State was the employer, and the employee were the people. People were free to choose and leave a job if they wished, and yet most of them wanted to work. Most of the Soviet Union's urban population were gathered in the eastern half of Russia, and the other half was rural. Population, continuing on, Russian population suffered greatly from the wars and revolutions. It lost over 30 million with Russian Revolution. What happened in the Russian Revolution was Poland withdrew. It was no longer under Russian control. Finland withdrew. Romania, independent. Baltic states, independent. Cars to Turkey, 400,000 independent. So Poland had 18 million people. Finland had 3 million people. Romania also about 3. Baltic states, 5 million. Because these countries were no longer under Russian control, they lost over 30 million people, citizens. 2 million citizens of the former Russian Empire died in the Russian Civil War, and further about 2 million people emigrated overseas. What happened during this internal, almost we call it Russian Civil War, or the Russian Revolution? Russian Empire ceased to exist, and the Bolsheviks took power. And there was a struggle between the Red Army and the White Army. And each of these armies, Red Army being communist, of the Bolsheviks, and the White Army being more loyalist. They were royalists. They were loyal to the Russian Empire. And each of these armies, they brought on the war, very terrible war. So they call it the White Terror. And in response to that, the Red Terror. These terror regimes and control, they fought for power, which brought on the Russian Civil War. What was pretty saddening about is that the Red Terror with the Red Army, they basically based that on the French Revolution after the revolution, it brought on the reign of terror. They modeled their government from this incident that happened. So many people died, and many people who were persecuted, they left the country. Around 800,000 to about 1.2 million people died during the purge of the 1930s. So yeah, just a lot of people died. Soviet Union, the population also suffered about 26.6 million deaths during World War II, including 1.3 million infant mortality. I'm going to talk a little bit more about infant mortality in a second. But Soviet Union by far lost the most people in World War II. They lost so many people. The population of Soviet Union, they increased about 2 million per year, except periods of wartime, famine, and purges. 2 million, roughly about 2 million people per year. The life expectancy and infant mortality is very important because population determines economy, determines the youth of the nation. It determines how the nation will progress in the future. So life expectancy is very important. The newborn Soviet child in the 1926-27 had the life expectancy of 44.4 years. That dramatically increased in 1958-59 to 68.6, and at this time the life expectancy between men and women were different, meaning 1958-59, this was after World War II and after the Korean War. The life expectancy was 66.2 for men and 72.9 for women. That was the average life expectancy. Infant mortality, again, was included 1.3 infant mortality. It was not very good. And it began to be better as time went on. This picture of a child and Russian soldiers, that there. And then we come to religion. Religion in the Soviet Union. This is a picture of the current Russian president, Vladimir Putin, with some members of what it seems to be Eastern Orthodox Jewish, and these religious beliefs were, in essence, because Karl Marx being the author of the Communist Manifesto and the idea between the communist ideology, the Soviet Union promoted a state atheism as other socialist communist countries have. It promoted state atheism from 1928, almost from the beginning, because remember, 1922, that's when the Bolsheviks took power from Tsarist Russia, and it promoted state atheism from 1928 right until 1941. Religion, in essence, were largely discouraged and heavily persecuted. It's fine when there's discouraging from the government, but if there's heavily persecuted, religion was heavily persecuted. Russia remained very secular, 1945 until 1991, right up until the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Half of the population professed religious beliefs, though. That's about 150 million. Russian Orthodox was by far, that's about 1/5, 20% of the population. So, right, 20% of 150 million. 20% of the half of the population profess religious beliefs. In Russian Orthodox, 15% was Muslim, the rest Protestant, Georgian Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, Roman Catholics were each 7%, and Jewish were less than 1%. Atheist population in the half, were about 60% of that population. So that were the religious demographics. Religion right now in current Russia plays a big part. If you look at search up some videos on YouTube about Vladimir Putin talking about religion, he sees Russia as an Orthodox Christian country. And some of the things he says seems like I'm going to stop right there. But look up some of the things he says. He knows what his people largely hold on to. It's faith in Russian Orthodox, mostly majority Russian Orthodox. Putin is known also to have understanding of Russian Jewish influences, and very interesting to see how this in the Soviet Union, it was religion largely was discouraged, heavily persecuted, and yet there were flourishing of some religion in the background of all things. And then we come to our government. And government, I put government and economy together. And in our slide, I have the leaders together. So in essence, I'm going to talk about basically the government, its ideas, economy, and then I will talk about each of the leaders in history. Again, Russia, religion was a binding force. It is a binding force in sociology right now, and yet it was discouraged. So they had to find this kind of social unification in government and economy, in policy. So 1922, 1927, Federal Leninist one-party social republic was established. From 1927 to 53, Federal Marxist-Leninist one-party socialist state under Stalinist totalitarian dictatorship. From 1953 to 1990, Federal Marxist-Leninist one-party socialist republic. And then 1990 to 1991, Federal multi-party semi-presidential republic was established. So there were the four main government economies of the Soviet Union, spanning from 22 to 27, 27 to 53. So Lenin, Stalin, after Stalin, like a period is called de-Stalinization that happened from 53 all the way to 1990. Basically, Stalin had a huge influence in how Russia went from a Leninist Bolshevik country to almost a totalitarian communist nation to a totalitarian state. And then period of de-Stalinization, this at the height of the Cold War, they started de-Stalinization, which means they moved away from totalitarian tendencies. And then basically 1991, Russia began to show signs of collapse with multi-party instead of a one-party socialist republic. What I'm going to do right now is go over each of the leaders of the Soviet Union, as you see on screen. And I'm going to go over each of them, and I will briefly mention its history, its our understanding of how Soviet Union came to be, and I'll try to mention that as best as possible. First leader, as you know, is Vladimir Lenin, founder of the Soviet Union. He served from 1922 to 1924 until his death. Vladimir Lenin he was his actual name is not Lenin. His actual name is Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. He was born 22nd of April 1870, and he died 21st of January 1924. But he's better known under his alias Lenin, Vladimir Lenin. He was a Russian revolutionary, he was a politician, political theorist. He served as the first and founding head of government, head of state for Soviet Union, Soviet Russia from 1917 to 1924. But 1922 was the Soviet Union. Under his administration, Russia became a one-party state. He was a Marxist, and his ideology was called Leninism. Lenin was born in a middle-class family. He embraced revolutionary social ideas when his brother, following his brother's execution. He was educated under Tsarist schools, Tsarist ideals, but he was expelled, and he went to St. Petersburg in 1893. He became a senior Marxist activist. He was arrested, and basically he was exiled to Western Europe, where he became a prominent political theorist in the Marxist Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. So in 1903, he led the Bolshevik faction against Julius Markov's Mensheviks, following Russia's failed revolution of 1905, he campaigned for the First World War to be transformed into a Europe-wide proletarian revolution. So he wanted World War I to be a workers' revolution. He didn't want the war to be just a war, but he wanted to be a worldwide revolution. He believed, being a Marxist, that he believed that the overthrow of capitalism and replace that with socialism, that was going to happen in World War I. So 1917, February Revolution, it ousted the Tsar and established a provisional government, and he returned to Russia to play a leading role in the October Revolution. So February, Tsar's Russia overthrown. That was a temporary government. February to October, and that October Revolution is where Lenin came and Bolsheviks overthrew the new regime. So October Revolution is also known as the Bolshevik Revolution. Lenin's Bolshevik government initially shared power with the leftist social revolutionaries in a multi-party constituent assembly, but 1918 is centralized power. I told you that Soviet Union was highly centralized form of government. The new Communist Party was controlled by Lenin's administration. Lenin's administration basically redistributed the land among the peasantry, nationalized banks, and largest industry. So it wasn't privately owned anymore, it was owned by the nation state. That's one of the keys of socialism or communism. It withdrew from the First World War by signing a treaty with other nations because war was very unpopular. Opponents suppressing the Red Terror in response to the White Terror by the White Army. A violent campaign modeled after the French Reign of Terror. Tens of thousands, even 100,000 were killed, interned in concentration camps, were tortured. Lenin's administration defeated the right and left-wing anti-Bolshevik armies in the Russian Civil War from 1917 to 22. This oversaw and Lenin was interesting because he had to not only just revolutionize but hold the country together or heal it after its formation. In 1917 to 22, that's when that happened. Lenin was responsible also for the new economic policy. So Soviet Union had roots in the October Revolution, 1917, overthrew provisional government that replaced the monarchy, established Soviet Republic. So there was this Red Army, anti-Bolshevik force, the White Guard or White Army. They fought together. White Terror organized mass killings carried out by the White Army during Russian Civil War, 1917, 1922 to 23. So in response to that Red Terror, modeled after, again, French Revolution, French Reign of Terror, they sought to eliminate one another, but basically by 1922, Bolsheviks prevailed. They formed the Soviet Union. Lenin became the head of state. Lenin came to power, introduced new economic policy, return of free market. Private property resulted in economic recovery, but guess what? Lenin died in 1920, just 2 years later after he solidified his power. So 1922 to 1924. So who came after Lenin was the most important, because he would solidify what Lenin, often his ideas were called Leninism. Who would solidify Lenin's idea and understanding and ideology of Marx? That was the question. Lenin died in 1924, just 2 years after the Civil War ended. So what Lenin did was he kept on the revolution. He failed in 1905, succeeded in 1917 October Revolution, overthrew the Tsar. But what happened after that was Civil War. So Lenin didn't really have time to really implement his policies. His policies, ideas were called Leninism, but his most significant one was the new economic policy, which did return free market, did return to private property. It resulted in Russian economic recovery. So there were clues here from the beginning that if you did open the country up a little bit to free market, private property, there were economic signs of recovery. and yet that wouldn't prove to be the case with Stalin. Joseph Stalin became the next Soviet Union leader. He served from 1924 to 1953. Joseph Stalin. Famously, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, he was born 18th of December 1878 and he died 5th of March 1953. He was Georgian. He was a Georgian revolutionary, and he was the Soviet Union ruler from 27 until 1953. Some say 24, right after Lenin died. He served as General Secretary and Chairman. He consolidated power as de facto dictator, a sole ruler by the 1930s. He had a communist ideology committed to Leninist interpretation of Marxism, but he formalized his ideas, not just Marxist-Leninism, but his own policies, and he's known as Stalinism. He was born to a very poor family in Georgia. He attended a seminary, Tbilisi Spiritual Seminary, before eventually joining the Marxist Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, and he went on to edit the newspaper. He raised funds for Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik faction. He robbed, kidnapped, and protection rackets. So he repeatedly he was arrested. He underwent several internal exiles. After the Bolsheviks seized power during the October Revolution, he created a one-party state under the newly formed Communist Party. Stalin joined its governing Politburo, serving in the Russian Civil War before overseeing the Soviet Union's establishment in 1922. Stalin assumed leadership of the country following Lenin's death in 1924. Under Stalin, socialism in one country became a central tenet of the party's dogma. He implemented the 5-year plan. The country underwent, under his 5-year plans, agricultural collectivization, remember the farm agriculture, rapid industrialization, and it created a centralized command economy. So this led to severe food production disruption that caused the famine of 1932-33. He eradicated accused enemies of the working class in the Great Purges. This again, in these purges, so many people died. Over 1 million people were in prison. At least 700,000 were executed by 1934-39. Killed his own people. By 1937, he had absolute control over the party and the government. Stalin ruled with an iron fist. He was a dictator. He was Leninism, Marxist-Leninism. He promoted that, and yet he supported anti-fascist movements in the Civil War, and he was known for, he was a man of contradiction. When Stalin came to power, he suppressed all the opposition. Trotsky was his main rival. He inaugurated a command economy, but this resulted in man-made famine. He was known for extreme paranoia. August 23, 1939, he signed what is known to be as the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. This shocked the world because it did fund anti-fascists. He seemed to show some anti-fascist tendencies, but you never knew it, Stalin. When you thought the country benefited, he signed the Non-Aggression Pact to shock the world. What Germans had in mind were make peace with the Soviets first. Great, they were usually the enemy, but make a pact, make a peace treaty, attack the Western Front, invade England, and then go over and invade Russia. That's exactly what happened in June 1941. Germans invaded Russia, the Soviet Union. The Soviet forces eventually captured Berlin. They won World War II in Europe, May 9th, 1945. Pact with Nazi Germany, 1939-1941. As Marxist-Leninist, Stalin even expected an inevitable conflict between competing capitalist powers. So after Nazi Germany annexed Austria, then part of Czechoslovakia, Germany started slowly increasing its territories. So 1930, Stalin recognized a war was coming, and Stalin really wanted to maintain Soviet neutrality. They didn't want another war. Remember, I think Stalin remembered what happened in World War I, how Tsar's Russia was involved. It virtually bankrupted the state. So many people were discontent with the war, and it resulted in the downfall of Tsar's Russia. Stalin was hoping that a German war against France and Britain would lead to Soviet dominance in Europe. He calculated that if the Soviet Union was neutral, German war against Europe would lead to Soviet dominance. Militarily, Soviets also faced a threat from the east, so Soviet troops clashing against the Japanese against the latter 30s. So Stalin initiated the military buildup with Red Army more than doubling between 39 and 41. Although its haste expanded, many of the officers were poorly trained. Between 40 and 41, he also purged the military, leaving it with a severe shortage of trained officers when the war broke out. So his purges and his policies were detrimental because he would purge the trained officers, and the officers that replaced them weren't trained. As Britain and France seemed unwilling to commit to alliance with the Soviet Union, Stalin saw a better deal with the Germans. And on May 1939, Stalin replaces Western-oriented Foreign Minister Maxim Litvinov with Molotov. And May 1939, Nazi Germany began negotiations with the Soviets, proposing that Eastern Europe be divided between two powers. So Stalin saw this opportunity to increase Russian territory and basically delay what was inevitable, like a temporary peace with Germany. August 1939, Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Germany, which led to a non-aggression pact. Week later, Germany invaded Poland, sparking UK and French, United Kingdom and France to declare war on Germany. 17th of September, Red Army entered eastern Poland officially to restore order amidst the collapse of the Polish state. Germany and Soviet Union exchanged some of their newly conquered territories. Germany gained linguistically Polish-dominated areas of province, Warsaw province. The Soviets, they wanted more of Finland, but it became what happened was they tried to annex and conquer the Finland, but Finland, there was Finnish resistance, and there was an interim peace treaty. Red Army incorporated the Baltic states. Remember, they lost these areas after the October Revolution. But what happened in 1941, the pact did not last. Hitler changed his mind. He broke the pact in June 1941. Germany invaded the Soviet Union. He initiated the war on the Eastern Front. Although intelligence agencies repeatedly warned of Germany's intentions, Stalin nevertheless was taken by surprise. German tactic blitzkrieg were highly effective. Soviet Air Force in the Western was destroyed within 2 days. Soon Ukraine, Belarusia, Baltic states were under German occupation. Leningrad was under siege. Soviet refugees were flooding into Moscow, surrounding cities. Germany's Luftwaffe was bombing Moscow. By October, the Wehrmacht was amassing for a full assault on the capital of Moscow. Plans were made to evacuate the Soviet government. Stalin decided to remain in Moscow, believing his flight would damage troop morale. German advance on Moscow was halted after 2 months of battle, increasingly harsh weather conditions. That's what happened in World War II. But German advance was halted. They didn't get to Moscow. By 1942, Soviets began to retake important German strategic forces. Eventually, what happened was Soviet forces eventually captured Berlin, came all the way to Berlin, and won World War II in Europe, May 9, 1945. Well, what happened right after that was that Russia captured the state, all the state up until East Berlin. It became the Eastern Bloc with the Berlin Wall. Soviet dominance formed in the Eastern Bloc. The Cold War began 1947 under his rule. This was the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc. So Western Bloc, it united against the Soviet dominance in the East. Basically, this Western Bloc, it formed NATO. It led to the formation of NATO. NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was formed 1949. So 2 years after victory in VE Day, victory in Europe, before when Soviet Russia celebrated 1945. The captured states became Eastern Bloc. Cold War began 1947. 2 years after that, Western Bloc was formed with NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, 1949. And that led to the height of the Cold War. In World War II, the big three, there were the alliances, right? In World War II, Joseph Stalin was one of the big three. Interestingly, Stalin was increasingly depicted as a positive figure. In 1942 Time magazine, Stalin was the man of the year. Stalin learned people in Western countries were calling him affectionately called Uncle Joe. He was initially offended, regarding it as sort of undignified, but there were mutual suspicions between Stalin and Churchill, but the US president Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, he smoothed the relationship between Churchill and Stalin. This uneasy alliance led to the victory in Europe and victory in the Pacific. These three figures were known together as the Big Three. Churchill, in history, Churchill flew to Moscow to visit Stalin in 1942, again 1944. Stalin scarcely left Moscow throughout the war, with Roosevelt, Churchill frustrated with his reluctance to travel to meet with these Big Three. November 43, Stalin met with Churchill, Roosevelt in Tehran, location of Stalin's choosing. There, Stalin and Roosevelt got on well, both desiring post-war dismantling of the British Empire. Tehran, the trio agreed that to prevent Germany rising to military prowess yet again, German states should be broken up. Roosevelt and Churchill also agreed Stalin's demand that the German city should be declared Soviet territory. Stalin was also very impatient for UK-US to open Western Front, pressure of the East, so that's what they did. And the Big Three, very famous, met at Yalta, 1945. Leaders met at the Yalta Conference, the Big Three. Roosevelt, Churchill conceded to Stalin's demand Germany pay Soviet Union $20 billion in reparations. And the Red Army seized Berlin. Hitler committed suicide. Germany surrendered in May. Stalin wanted Hitler captured alive. He had his remains brought to Moscow, prevent them from becoming a relic for Nazi sympathizers. Red Army conquered German territory. They discovered extermination camps that Nazi administration had run. Soviet soldiers engaged in looting, pillaging most of Eastern Europe. Stalin refused to punish the offenders after receiving a complaint about this. Germany defeated Stalin, switched focus to war with Japan, transferring 500,000 troops to the Far East, and World War II ended with the surrender of Japan in 1945. Then Joseph Stalin, he served from 1953, and he died. Right when he died, Georgy Malenkov, he became a temporary leader for a year, and then he passed on. Malenkov he was Soviet president. He briefly served. He succeeded Joseph Stalin, but he relinquished control of the party, and he became embroiled in a power struggle with Nikita Khrushchev. That culminated in his removal of his premiership. This power struggle with Khrushchev led to the succession of Malenkov and Malenkov following Stalin's death on the 5th of March. He temporarily emerged as Soviet leader's successor by replacing him both chairman, council of ministries, or premier. But only 9 days later, this Politburo forced him to give up the later position while letting him remain the premiership. Subsequently, Malenkov contented himself serving as the president's highest ranking member. but he was eclipsed in early 1954 by Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev. He was forced to resign, and he organized a failed coup against Khrushchev. In 1957, Malenkov was exiled to Kazakhstan. He was expelled from the party altogether in 1961. He officially retired and remained and had a low profile for the remainder of his life. 1953 onward to 1964, Nikita Khrushchev came to power. As soon as Stalin died in 1953, de-Stalinization began. Under Khrushchev, this period is called the Khrushchev thaw, the Cold War kind of ice relationship between the West and Russia. But Khrushchev relaxed censorship, relaxed repression, and the country was a little bit more open. Country developed rapidly during this era. Millions of people moved to industrialized cities. So Khrushchev was significant in the development of Russia into a period of de-Stalinization and to become a little bit more of a modern state. Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev was born 15th of April 1894. He died 11th of September 1971. He led the Soviet Union from 1953 all the way to 1964. During his rule, Khrushchev stunned the world with his denunciation of Stalin's crimes. He began de-Stalinization. He sponsored Soviet space programs. He narrowly avoided nuclear war over Cuba in the Cuban Missile Crisis. He successfully negotiated with the United States to reduce Cold War tensions. But his recklessness, usually his tendencies to be unpredictable, led to his censorship, his removal from power. He was replaced by Brezhnev as president, as a leader of Russia. Khrushchev was born in 1894 in a village in Western Russia. He was a metal worker, and he became a political commissar during the Russian Civil War. He supported Stalin's purges. He approved of his arrests, but he later denounced them when he became to power and started de-Stalinization. In 1953, Stalin's death basically triggered a power vacuum, power struggle with Khrushchev and Malenkov, but Khrushchev emerged victorious. He consolidated his authority as first secretary in 1956. In his address, known as a secret speech, he denounced Stalin's purges, although before he supported them. He denounced Stalin's purges. He ushered in a less repressive era, open, more relaxed censorship, relaxed political freedom, more political freedom. He ushered in this thaw. It's called the Khrushchev thaw. His domestic policies aimed at bettering the lives of ordinary citizens were well-minded, well-intended, but very ineffective, and especially regarding to agriculture and production. He hoped eventually to rely on his missile national defense he ordered major cuts in traditional military spendings. Despite all these reforms, Khrushchev thought more open desalinization policies. His office during his time, the height of the Cold War, culminated in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuban Missile Crisis, known as the October Crisis. This missile scare was a confrontation between U.S. and Soviet Union. It escalated into international crisis. But what happened was, because Americans placed missiles on Turkey and Italy, this was matched with Soviet missiles, Baltic ballistic missiles in Cuba, Soviet-controlled Cuba, communist Cuba. Despite the short time frame, the Cuban Missile Crisis remained the defining moment in U.S. and USSR national security nuclear preparation. It became the instance where the world came the closest to a all-out nuclear war. So American Jupiter ballistic missiles in Italy, Turkey, and also the Bay of Pigs invasion, the failed invasion in 1961. This led to Khrushchev answering Cuba's request for a placing of the nuclear missiles in the island of Cuba to deter a future invasion. So in agreement with Cuban then Prime Minister Fidel Castro, very famous, in July 1962, construction of a number of missile launch facilities started later that summer. Meanwhile, 1962, the United States elections were underway. The White House denied charges for months. Basically, John F. Kennedy convened a meeting, came dangerously close to nuclear war with the Cuban Missile Crisis, Soviet deployment, there were blockades. The crisis ended in October 27, much after conversation between Soviet Union and Kennedy's cabinet. Kennedy secretly agreed to remove all the missiles in Turkey and possibly some in Italy, the former on the border of Soviet, because Turkey was basically on the border of Soviet Union, in exchange for Khrushchev removing all the missiles in Cuba. There were some dispute whether removing all the missiles from Italy were part of the secret agreement, but Khrushchev wrote in his memoirs that it was. Crisis ended when McNamara gave the order to dismantle the missiles in both Italy and Turkey. So what happened was the Soviets already had 162 nuclear warheads in Cuba. U.S. did not believe it. They were there. Soviets and Cubans almost certainly would have responded to an invasion by using those nuclear weapons, even though Castro believed that every human in Cuba would likely die as a result. So Khrushchev knew, but also had not considered the fact that he had submarines armed with nuclear weapons. The U.S. Navy may not have known about that. Khrushchev knew he was losing control. President Kennedy had been told early 1961 that nuclear war would likely kill a third of humanity, with most of all that's concentrated in U.S., USSR, Europe, and China. Khrushchev may well have received similar reports from his military. So Kennedy immediately responded, and then with the secret agreement, the practical effect of this pact removed rockets from Italy and Turkey. Soviet didn't want to resort to nuclear war, and they removed missiles from Cuba. After this, Khrushchev, both Kennedy and Khrushchev, took every step to avoid full conflict, despite their pressures from each of their respective governments. Khrushchev held power for a little bit more after that, for 2 years. Yeah, no one will know how close the Cuban Missile Crisis came, but it ended in 1962. Khrushchev held power for 2 years after that, but basically Brezhnev, he took over Khrushchev. Brezhnev was born 1906, and he died 1982. He led the Soviet Union as General Secretary and Chairman. His 18-year term was second only to Joseph Stalin. His political stability and significant foreign policy, his successes, it was marked by corruption, inefficiency, economic stagnation, and growing gaps with the West. Also, during this time, he continued the space programs of the Khrushchev era. So USSR took a very early lead on the space race. The first ever satellite in the world was from Russia. The first ever human space flight was also from the Soviet Union. First crew to land on another planet was the Soviet Union. So Brezhnev continued these, but what happened was that Soviet Union is significantly, the United States also just caught up with this technology, but Soviet Union faced this widening gap between the technological developments of the West and the Soviet Union. Brezhnev was born to a Russian working class, and after the results of the Russian Revolution, creation of the Soviet Union, Brezhnev joined the Communist Party's Youth League in 1923, becoming an official party member in 1929. Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. He joined the Red Army as commissar, rose rapidly through the ranks, became a major general in World War II. Following the war's end, Brezhnev was promoted to party central committee and rose to become a full member of the Politburo by 1957. He amassed enough power in 1964 during Khrushchev's rule as first secretary of the CPSU, the most powerful position in the Soviet regime. Brezhnev's conservative, pragmatic approach to governance is significantly stabilized, because if you look at it, up until Stalin, there was no ruler who served longer than him. Everyone was 2 years. Khrushchev was quite long, but Brezhnev was the one who brought stability, because Khrushchev was pretty much always losing control. Brezhnev was careful to minimize dissent among party leadership by reaching decisions through consensus. He achieved Soviet nuclear parity with the United States, legitimized country's hegemony over Eastern Europe. The massive arms buildup and widespread military interventionism under Brezhnev's leadership, it's expanded the Soviet Union's global influence, especially in the Middle East and Africa, because Brezhnev really focused on stabilizing its influence reach the Middle East and Africa. But his disregard for political reform, it also impacted in societal decline, known as the Brezhnev stagnation. So in addition to pervasive corruption following economic growth, This period was characterized by increasing technological gap. Technology was advancing rapidly in the United States, but Soviet Union started falling behind. Brezhnev's government was eventually denounced by Gorbachev because of its inefficiencies, although it was stable. After 1975, Brezhnev's health began to deteriorate rapidly, and he withdrew from international affairs, but he held on to power. He died in 10th of November 1982. He was succeeded as General Secretary by Yuri Andropov. Yuri Vladimirovich Andropov, he was the sixth paramount leader. He was born 15th of June 1914 and February 1984. Fourth, he was the sixth ruler. He died in 1984. So basically, from 1982 to 84, he ruled for 2 years. Following 18-year rule, he served briefly 2 years. Andropov served as the Soviet ambassador to Hungary from 1954 to 57, during which time he was involved in the suppression of the Hungarian uprising. He was named chairman of the KGB, 10th of May, 67. In his position, he saw a massive crackdown on dissent. And Brezhnev suffered a stroke, and Andropov effectively dictated Soviet policymaking with Foreign Minister Gromko and Greco of Defense Minister. And upon Brezhnev's death, Yuri Andropov succeeded him as General Secretary. During his short tenure, he sought to eliminate corruption and inefficiency within the Brezhnev regime. During his tenure, Cold War intensified. He was at a loss for how to handle the growing crisis in the Soviet economy. His major long-term impact was bringing new forces generation of young reformers. Ligachev, Rizkov, Mikhail Gorbachev being one of them. His health resulted in kidney failure, and Andropov died shortly after leading the country for about 15 months. And his successor, Konstantin Cherenko, also he died in 85. So he only was in power for another year after Andropov. Konstantin Chernenko was a Soviet politician. He led the Soviet Union in 84 to 85, just about 1 year. He was born to a poor family in Siberia. Chernenko joined Komsomol, which was Communist Party's youth league, became full member of the party in 31. He served under Brezhnev, but Brezhnev took over as first secretary. Chernenko rose to head of the General Department Central Committee. After Brezhnev, his successor Yuri Andropov, Chernenko was elected General Secretary of 1984. Due to his rapidly failing health, he was often unable to fulfill, and he died in 1985. So he was very short, but what happened is he gave way to Mikhail Gorbachev. He was the last Soviet leader. Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, born 2nd of March 1931, and he was in office from 15th of March 1990 25th of December 1991. Under his tenure, he is the last leader, head of state of the Soviet Union. Under his leadership, he moved towards social democracy, but eventually his office was abolished and Soviet Union was dissolved. He is of Russian and Ukrainian heritage. Gorbachev was born in Prague to a poor peasant family. He grew up under the rule of Stalin, and he grew up in a collective farm, and he joined the Communist Party after that. He saw Soviet governance as one-party state, according to that Marxist-Leninist doctrine. While studying under Moscow State University, he married a fellow student. He moved to Stavropol. He worked for Komsomol youth organization. He became a keen proponent of desalinization under Khrushchev. He was appointed first party secretary of Stavropol. Within 3 years, with the death of Soviet leader Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko, the Politburo elected Gorbachev as general secretary and as de facto head of government in 1985. So in 3 years, they saw a succession of leaders just dying due to health reasons, and Gorbachev became the leader. Although committed to preserving the Soviet state social ideas, Gorbachev believed significant reform was necessary. Particularly after the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, just 1 year after he took power. Because partially due to Chernobyl disaster, he withdrew from Soviet-Afghan war, embarked on summits with the United States President Ronald Reagan to limit nuclear weapons and end the Cold War. His policy was very famous glasnost, which is openness. It enhanced freedom of speech and press, while perestroika, reconstructing, he sought to decentralize economic decision-making to improve efficiency in economic dealings. His democratization, this included elected people's duties. He undermined the one-party state. He declined to intervene in military affairs with Eastern Bloc countries. So all these like revolutionary ideas from Marxist-Leninist Soviet socialist state, of course, this brought opposition from Marxist-Leninist hardliners. This launched an unsuccessful August coup against Gorbachev in 1991. In the wake of this, the Soviet Union dissolved against Gorbachev's wishes, and then he resigned. After leaving from office, Gorbachev Foundation was established. And what he did was became a vocal critic of Boris Yeltsin, who succeeded him as president of Russia, and also Vladimir Putin as president of Russia. His Russian Social Democratic movement was widely considered as one of the most significant in the 20th century, second half of the 20th century. Gorbachev remains the subject of controversy though. He's even known as the Nobel Peace Prize baccalaureate. But his human rights abuses, even though he was known as the person to end the Cold War, his human rights abuses still leave a dark mark in his tenure. The reunification of Germany and other fall of the Berlin Wall, but all these good things are attributed to him, and yet in his own country, in Russia, he's often derided for not stopping the Soviet Union's collapse. This led to reducing decline of global influence, Russia's global influence. Many people attribute to him for bringing the economic crisis. So yeah, this is the 8 Soviet Union leaders. And we're going to stop right there. And we're going to continue on with the different countries, following countries. We're going to talk about socialism, and with that socialism, we're going to talk about the People's Republic of China, and then we're going to talk about North Korea with totalitarianism, Germany fascism, and then United States for capitalism. And we're going to hopefully try to cover the case for Christian sociology, introduce that today. Introduce the case for Christian sociology in the next lecture. So this is what I have for lecture 5. And in the next lecture, we will continue on with the institutional sociology. We'll wrap that up, and then we'll go into Christian sociology. We're going to begin the Christian case for Christian sociology finally in the next 6th lecture. Thank you.